and salutations, and welcome to Radio Dayz, a podcast radio program that delves into the world of terrestrial radio. It's DJs and on-air personality, and you, all fans of radio as a medium. Here's your host, Ron.
Hello and welcome to Season 4, the Season 4 premiere episode of Radio Dayz The Podcast. After a short hiatus, we are finally back, and I'm very excited about this show and about this new season as I have some awesome, amazing guests coming your way, and we're going to start out with a bang as my guest today is one of the great radio personalities that has ever opened up a mic. But before I bring him in, I want to let you know about the podcast here. You can hear it as Buzzsprout, as well as all the major podcast platforms like Spotify, Google, Apple Podcasts. You can also watch it via YouTube as well as at ronrobinsonstudios.com. Radio Dayz The Podcast is sponsored by Radio Dayz 101 Years of Radio, a new documentary series about the history of terrestrial radio. Hear the story from those who lived it. Dick Purton, Doug Podell, Duke Facour, Big Jim Edwards, Ken Calvert, Jill Forsyth, Greg Russell, just a few of the scores of radio personalities and historians who appear in this docuseries. You can also watch the entire 5-part series on the free streaming service Reveal, that's R-E-V-E-E-L, or on Vimeo. Find the link for Vimeo, as well as more information on this series at my website, ronrobinsonstudios.com. As I mentioned, my guest today is a Detroit radio legend. Worked in the business for over 50 years. He's been heard on W4, WLLZ, WRIF, WOMC, just to name a few. He's also been on television as a reporter for Good Afternoon Detroit, and occasionally he would guest host on the legendary Detroit television show Kelly and Company. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Redford native and CMU graduate, Mr. Jim J.J. Johnson. Jim, thanks for coming on the program. How are you today?
Ron, thanks for having me. It was fun.
Yeah, no, I wanted to get you while I've been trying to get you as a guest for a couple years now, but you've been busy at OMC, but you're newly retired, and I saw you a couple weeks ago. Have you figured out what you're going to do in retirement now?
No, Ron, I told myself at the time I made this decision, I was giving myself the first 3 months of this year to kind of sort it out. And it's still unreal. I feel it's been 2 months, and I still kind of feel like I'm on vacation. It doesn't feel right yet. It's going to take years for a sleeping pattern to emerge, because every day is a different story. But we'll get there. We'll figure it out. I'm just trying to recondition myself, I guess. Charge the batteries again to get ready for whatever the final chapter is going to be.
You did mornings for so long. Are you still waking up super early, or have you been able to curb that?
Yeah, here's the thing. Doing morning radio, and anybody who's done morning radio will tell you this. I talk to Dick Purton about it all the time. It's a weird animal, because when I was doing it, and especially the kind of format we were in, there were a lot of late night activities.
Sure.
So you'd only be able to get a few hours of sleep, and then you'd have to go in and do your show all over again, right? So it was for, 32 years at the beginning of that. It was 3 hours in the afternoon and 3 hours at night, and that was my sleep schedule.
Oh, I can't even. You just get used to that, right? That just becomes your life, right?
You do, but the problem is it ruins whatever that weird thing in your head is that is your body clock. It ruins it.
Yeah,
it just ruins it.
Yeah. Now, were you ever like because I did mornings, but when I did mornings for a little time, I was a night person. Eventually, I became, I'd go to bed early. Did you ever get to where you were just like, I'm going to bed early, or were you always up late?
No. And because, as you know from doing mornings, there's a lot of content, and you got to stay on top of it. And I'd go to bed at 9 o'clock and lay there thinking, what am I missing for tomorrow's show?
What am I going to do, right? Yeah. So before we get into your illustrious career, Jim, I want to take back to a young Jim Johnson. Obviously, I mentioned you were raised in Redford, but what were you listening to on the radio as a youngster before you even had the idea that you wanted to pursue a career in broadcasting?
Well, there wasn't really the fascination with FM radio, so my go-to stations were all AM stations, probably WKNR. The biggest influence in my career was the heyday of CKLW in the late 60s. And once in a while at night, if the weather was right, I would get LS from Chicago.
Right. Yeah. Now, was it the programming, or were you infatuated with the radio personalities? What was it about radio that drew you in as a listener?
Well, it wasn't just radio, it was TV as well. I think broadcasting in general was just a fascination of mine. I love the personalities. And, think about the time. This was like, we're talking mid to late 60s. That's when the entire world of music changed before our eyes. Right. The music changed, and the music changed our culture all at the same time. So I feel like I was coming of age as FM radio was coming of age, as rock and roll music was coming of age. It was kind of a perfect storm, and I felt like it all fit my personality and who I wanted to become.
Well, what you did,
I should have shot higher.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I think you did all right for yourself. I mean, you and some of the work you were doing early on, you were definitely a trendsetter. But before that, when you did say, I'm going to get into this as a career, what steps did you take, and talk about that transition? Okay, how did you get into radio? Let's start there.
Okay, easy. I got a scholarship to play football at Central Michigan University. So that was my main pursuit when I left high school. However, I was fortunate enough that it was Central Michigan, because Central Michigan University has the absolute best radio and broadcast curriculum in the Midwest for sure, and maybe even in the entire country. It was just a great place. So I lucked out there. And then between my freshman and sophomore year, I wasn't doing anything in radio at that point because I was playing football. But I came home for the summer, and I went to every radio station in Detroit and Flint and Windsor, and I said, I'll do anything, mow the lawn. I just want to be exposed to radio. I've never seen a radio station. One guy called me back, and it happened to be a guy that ran a station called WEXL in Ferndale, and they were a country gospel station. And the guy said, I got one shift a week from 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday until midnight. And your job is going to be racking up all of our religious programming. So back in those days, the tape machines were from the floor to the ceiling with these gigantic reels of tape. And I'd have to go rack the tapes up and start them at the right time. And then we would hear sermons from around the Detroit area, around the country, interspersed with live sermons from local Detroit area churches. And then every Sunday, a family, a preacher, his wife, and 2 kids would come in with their guitars, and they'd do gospel folk music live in studio. And I had to monitor that. Every once in a while, I got to throw in the call letters and maybe the temperature. But that was it. The guy did tell me, though, he said, it's a different animal today. The guy said, look, you're going to be here all those hours by yourself. You want to learn the business, you have free reign. Do whatever you want here. Teach yourself how all of this stuff works.
Wow.
And so I did that. After 3 weeks, a guy came on at midnight and did midnight to 6. He didn't show up. So I've been watching what he had done, because it went from religious programming to back to their country gospel format.
Okay.
So I stayed on and threw some country records on and cut in a couple of times with call letters and such. Tried to follow the format like I had witnessed the guy do. The morning guy was the program director. He came flying in hot, and he was pissed. And he said, what do you think you're doing? I said, well, your guy didn't show up. And back then, I didn't even know where to find the guy's phone number to call him to tell him. So he said, okay, well, thank you for doing that. And by the way, that guy's fired. I said, okay, I want the job. And he goes, no, because I don't want to train somebody else to do the 9 hours that you got done doing at midnight. He said, that's too much for me, and it's too much for you. I said, I just did it. It's 15 hours, and it's once a week. I can do it. He said, okay. And he took me back to a little closet off the studio with a bunch of 5-inch reels of audio tape. And he goes, pick your name out for yourself. Because back then, all these stations had jingle packages, and they were expensive. So when you got them done, it was easier to add a few fake names,
right,
so that they could sing your name in the jingle.
Right.
So he had a bunch of pre-made names for the station, and I had to pick one of them. That's who I became. So from that day forward, I was Bob Young with good country music on WEXL.
That is funny. That is funny.
But here's the punchline to all of it. That same radio station was on Woodward Heights. And when I went back to WOMC 12 years ago, where I finished my career, it's the same building, the same station, the same stick.
that's some cool stuff. You start where you end. You end where you start, I should say. Hey, now let me ask you this. How did you go? Was that was your first radio station? What was the second job you had in radio?
Well, I went back to play football and go back to school, but I started sniffing around the radio business up at Central Michigan University, and I walked into the AM station that we had on campus there, WCHP, and I said, "Hey, I'm interested in joining you guys in some capacity." And they said, "Well, do you have any experience in radio?" Ha, ha, ha. And I said, "Matter of fact, I do." And when I told them what I did, all of a sudden I was the king of the world because nobody had that kind of professional experience before.
Wow.
And from there, I went on to become the program director of that station. And the cool thing about that was every commercial radio station in northern Michigan, in mid-Michigan, and even as far down as Detroit would send letters to my station asking if they would recommend any talent because they had part-time job openings or whatever. I said, "Yeah, matter of fact, I can recommend somebody." And so I recommended myself. And from there, I got to move on to do part-time radio in Flint. And then from there, a year or so later, I ended up in Lansing. 3 knee injuries playing football. I was medically prevented from playing any more football. So I gave him back my scholarship. I moved to East Lansing, and I went to Michigan State as a guest student and worked at a couple of different stations in Lansing for a couple of years before I moved to Detroit.
And you moved to Detroit to take a job at W4, is that correct?
I moved to Detroit without a job. Because, I found that, I was young, it was the beginning of my career. I was eager and I was hungry.
Yeah.
Lansing just felt like it was mediocre and nobody wanted to put the effort in to take it a step further.
Okay.
I did, but I didn't get any support there. So I said, screw this. I'm going home to Detroit where I know things are cooking.
Right.
And see what I can do. Fortunately, right place, right time. I got a job right away as a weekend jock and did summer vacation relief for the full-time jocks. And in the fall, when that ended, the morning guy, who was Ken Calvert at the time, left to go sell records for Columbia Records. So the morning show was open. So I was offered a full-time gig doing the morning show. But back then, mornings were not that important.
Right. It was afternoon drive time that was king, right?
And night.
And nights.
Night was huge on FM rock radio back then. From there, I spent some time doing mornings, but then got moved up to middays, which is a big advance. And then I became the program director of W4. So what year are we talking here, Jim? 1977.
So what are the in 1977, what are the duties of a program director at a rock station like W4?
Well, it was trial by fire for me. I was doing middays, and here's how it went. Steve Dahl was doing our morning show at the time, and we had another guy named Mark Addy, who should be a familiar name to many radio listeners in the Detroit area.
Yeah.
So our boss, Bart Walsh, came up to us and said, "Okay, we are hiring a new program director. It's going to be one of you 3 guys. Go home and write an essay as to why it should be you. And I want to hear on Monday."
Wow,
and,
not much time to fill that out.
But he liked my essay better than the other 2, I guess. So I became the program director. So all the duties in the world, from picking the music to designing a format with the help of a consultant. And but first week I'm there, my boss comes up and says, "Okay, it's time to do budgets." And I said, "Okay, good. Enjoy yourself. Knock yourself out." And he said, No. That means you've got to do a budget for your department. Like, I have no idea what a budget is. And he said, well, he gave me a little boilerplate and I put together the best I could. The crazy thing is, what I found out by doing that is how crazy big the profit margin was in radio back in those days. It was over 40% profit.
Wow.
Yeah. That's partly how radio got ruined. Yeah. Because too many investment bankers saw 40% profit. No business makes that kind of money. Maybe we should invest in radio. And boom, then there was a tsunami of sales of radio stations, conglomeration. Then they relaxed the rules on ownership, and it became even crazier because now big conglomerates could come in and buy dozens and dozens and dozens of stations. But they weren't there for the radio. They didn't understand the art of it. It was just a business, and they were concerned and interested in the revenue.
Now, a lot of people I've talked to have done mornings. Their biggest hurdle is just when there's not a good cohesive relationship between the PD and, say, the morning guy, which you became famous for being the morning guy.
Wait a minute, hold on. Has there ever been a cohesive relationship between any morning radio personality and any program director?
So what's that dynamic like when you're your own program director? Is that freedom?
I love my program director.
I bet you did. So, I mean, you mentioned this. You're just starting it out. Did you even know what you were doing, or did you just kind of dumb luck your way into this? I
pretended I did.
Fake it until you make it, kind of thing.
I pretended until I figured it out. And I had help along the way.
So obviously, you mentioned Steve Dahl. Did you learn a lot from Steve Dahl, or who were some of your early influences to kind of, because you don't do what you did at W4 Wheels and WRIF, 3 stadiums. I mean, the success that you had by accident. Like, what was it? Trial and error? I mean, how was that? Well, talk me through the process, if you would.
Well, there was a lot of trial and error, but imitation was a tool in my toolbox. Actually, even from the beginning, when I was a kid, listening to guys like Pat Holliday, Dave Schaefer, guys on CKLW. And I would practice emulating their style in the shower, sort of thing, right? Pretending I was on one of those radio stations. So you pick up what other people do. You don't steal it, but you kind of adapt your personality. You kind of figure out how they come to where they are. Guys like, and then at W4, a lot of old timers people won't even recognize, like Jerry Goodwin, Jerry Lubin. Let's see, Dan Carlisle was a big influence on my adaptation.
Dennis Frawley, I'm sure. Dennis Frawley.
There were some mentors. Dennis Frawley, I never worked with Dennis, but I was aware of him, and yes, certainly stylistically. But those old guys were kind of mentors. At least to me they were. I don't think they thought they were in that position, but to me they were.
How did you put yourself with George and become JJ in the Morning Crew? Talk to me about the genesis of that, if you would.
It was not really a happy occasion when that happened because Steve Dahl, our morning guy, had gotten a job at WLS in Chicago, but he wasn't going to start for a few months. And George was not going with him. And we did some research and found out that a lot of listeners were entertained by the stuff that George added to the show. So we thought, okay, let's find somebody to work with George and have a new morning show, but keep George as sort of a thread of consistency. Well, Steve Dahl hated that idea. He claimed ownership to George. I said, well, are you taking George to Chicago? And he goes, no. I said, okay, so you want us just to fire George and put him out of a job. Is that what you're suggesting? He goes, well, I don't know. All I know is I don't want him doing this. And I said, well, we've made the managerial decision that George is going to stay, and he's going to be on your show right till the end so that we have this continued thread of consistency. We get to the last couple of weeks. I'm at the station late on a Sunday night doing something. I get a call from George saying that Dahl had just called him and said he didn't want him for the last couple of weeks. He wanted to say goodbye by himself.
Okay.
So, and he was doing crazy things like turning George's microphone off during bits and just being disruptive in that way. So I called Steve and I said, Steve, we already talked about this. George stays, including the last couple of weeks. So, I'm sorry you feel that way, but that's just how it's going to be. And he kept pushing back, and I pushed back, and he pushed back. And I finally said to him after a conversation, I said, I'm busy. I don't have time for this. Consider Friday your last day. Come in today and pick up your shit. You're out of here. So I slept at the station that night and met George at 5:30 in the morning and started the show together.
Now, before we move on from that, I want to ask you, because there's legendary stories about, since we're talking about him just going on the air and eating cereal. I mean, are these stories true? And as a PD, how do you deal with that?
Somehow he made that crazy stuff entertaining. Right? I mean, look at the stuff that Howard Stern has gotten away with over the years that doesn't sound entertaining to a lot of people. Right. But to a lot of people it is. And he was the right guy at the right time at the right place, and he was very successful. So, hey, if we were number one in the ratings with him eating cereal, I'll take it.
So he moves on to Chicago. How do you say, okay, I'm going to put myself with George, and we're going to create our own thing?
I didn't. It was only supposed to be temporary while we did a nationwide search for somebody who could come in and host the show, but with these characters that had already been established. So how do you go to a guy in Cincinnati and say, yeah, we'd like to hire you, but you're going to be working with old-time former wrestler, some cartoon characters,
right?
A fake mayor of the city, a fake sports announcer from the Detroit Tigers, and a fake hockey player from the Detroit Red Wings, and get them to wrap their head around that. So we never could find a guy, and to this day, we're still looking.
Well, you and George both, you mentioned you were big on imitations, and George, obviously, I mean, he did, you guys did the imitation of George Kell and Al Kaline, and then, of course, Mayor Coleman Young. I mean, I remember just almost getting in an accident while driving because that stuff was so funny. When did you know, okay, I think we have something here?
We drew from the energy of our listeners who seemed to be buying what we were selling at the time. And after, several months of working together, you get to know each other, and you start having some chemistry together. And that did for us for a long time. So we just rode the wave of that. And at the time, I was still the program director, but I was running out of gas. I told my boss, I said, I'll do mornings and program director for 1 year, and then something's going to change. By the end of that year, I wanted to go sell shoes at Tom McCann.
Oh my gosh!
I wanted to get the hell far away from radio as I could.
You were just burnt out. You were just burnt out, or
burnt out to a crisp, because being a program director is a full-time job, and doing morning radio is a time-and-a-half job.
Right.
So I told him, I said, look, here's my decision. I want to stay doing the morning show, but I want to leave the desk as program director. He lit me up for a week about what a terrible decision that was, that my future was in management, it wasn't on air, and I was crazy, this and that. But at the end of the day, he agreed to it, and we kept rolling.
Well, I think this is a good time as any. I pulled up a couple of clips. Here's you and George as JJ in the morning crew. Here's a little clip. Take a listen.
Get up, Detroit. It's a new day in the Motor City with JJ and the morning crew on the RIF.
Well, you woken up for good, but you want to stay in bed. Now you're staring at the ceiling, there's a pounding in your head.
Just brilliant stuff that you guys came up with. I mean, song parodies before. Go ahead. I'm sure it was cringeworthy.
It's a little cringeworthy now, but in the day it was okay. Here's the mistake we made. Yes, we did a lot of parodies, and they were hugely popular. We did an album. We did a bunch of CDs along the way, all for charity. But our methodology was terrible, because we got it in our head that if we were going to do a parody, we were going to do the whole damn song. I don't care if it was 4 minutes and 46 seconds
we're going to do
Don
the whole
Henley,
thing.
Boys of Summer. We're doing note for note, verse for verse of a parody of the whole thing. Not realizing at the time that it gets really old after about 40 seconds.
The novelty wears off, and people are like, okay, now we have to sit here for another 3 minutes, right?
Yes, exactly.
But with that said, that led to bigger things. Our mutual friend Mark Pasman still raves about being able to play guitar in the Bruiser Band. You guys were able to perform I think he's talked about you guys opened for Mitch Ryder at Pine Knob. I mean,
yep. There were a couple of... Yeah, it's a strange period of time. Now, first of all, I was not a member of the band. I mean, I was...
But it was your baby. I mean,
I did that one song, and I would play tambourine off beat. I couldn't even play tambourine, let alone any other kind of instrument.
That is funny. But did you, was that a whole, that's a whole thing. I mean, you're up there, playing music in front of a group of people. It's different than being behind a microphone with 4 guys in a room.
I think looking back on it, and I haven't had this thought in my head until you just brought it up, but really those kind of things that we did, from bar nights to doing concerts at various venues around town, mostly not as big as Pine Knob. That was just sort of a lucky day. But honestly, that was kind of our social media of the day.
Yeah.
There was no such thing as social media. So if we wanted to get out in front of a large group of people, that's how you did it.
Now, in addition to the imitations and the infamous parodies that you guys did, people really identified you with the whole anti-disco movement, the Dread Card.
Right.
Talk to me about how that came to be, because I know for most people, they don't know this. The disco movement started because a radio station in New York started getting huge ratings because they were playing disco, and then all across the country, every owner was like, "We got to play disco," and WRIF said no. I mean, no.
Well, it was a little, yes, you're correct about what the rest of the country was doing. And there was a move here in Detroit to do a disco radio station. In fact, we did one. I think it was WNIC at the time who decided they were going to go wall-to-wall disco. Steve Dahl actually began the trend at W4 just before he left. He planted the seed of what would become the anti-disco movement then. So, and as a rock station, we thought it was brilliant. We saw the value in becoming an anti-disco movement. And so we sat down together and came up with a little anti-disco club we could have hosted by our show.
Right.
And we needed to have a name for it. So we just sat down with a pencil and paper, started working on acronyms, and came up with DREAD, Detroit Rockers Engaged in the Abolition of Disco. Well, it was incredible. The response was unbelievable. And then by the time we came to WRIF, it was so big, and WRIF was owned by ABC, had a lot of money. So we could do whatever we wanted. So we started printing up these membership cards, hundreds of thousands of these cards. And to this day, I'll walk into somebody at a supermarket, they'll recognize me, and they'll pull one out of their wallet.
The Dread Card, yeah. And so,
50 years later.
I wanted to ask you about that Dread Card, because at first it became a club. I own the Dread Card. But I was talking to Buzz Van Houten not too long ago, and they made it. Harmony House was big on this. So if you had a Dread Card, it would actually give you discounts on records. How did that come to be?
Well, that was an evolution of the original Dread Card, because like anything else, an idea like that plays itself out after a number of years, and it's time to evolve or put a fresh coat of paint on it.
Right.
So we thought, okay, this is brilliant. Plus, it will help out our sales department. And as you know, revenue is everything. Cash is king. So we changed the acronym to the Detroit Rockers Engaged in the Acquisition of Discounts.
Okay. I don't remember that. That's funny. That's good, though.
Oh, yeah. So we would get with various advertisers, and whether it was a free Coke with a hot dog at Big Boy, or a cup of coffee at Dunkin' Donuts, or whatever the case may be, if you show your Dread Card, you get some kind of a bonus with your order.
That worked out well. I think it just added to the lure, I think, of having the Dread Card.
It kept it going for a while.
Now, I think we kind of jumped ahead, but how did you go from you talked about the evolution of Dread as when you went to WRIF, but why and when did you leave W4 to go to WRIF? What happened there?
Money.
It was all about money?
Yep. Well, two things. Our contract with W4 was over with, and they wanted to renew us, but they changed ownership at the time, and they changed station managers. So the owners were new, our boss was new, we were being courted by ABC at the time. You might remember this campaign.
Now, real quick, before you get to, was that was after you guys left before they went to country, or is that when that happened?
Oh yeah, no. We left before they went to country.
Okay, go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And we can circle back to that, but ABC had a television campaign across the country in their major markets, and the campaign was, we listened and we got who you told us you wanted.
Right.
And then, so they would go around in these big markets like Detroit, and they would cherry pick the hottest TV talent on all of the local stations, pay them a fortune, and put them together as a super team. Well, then the radio side of ABC said, well, if it worked for TV, that could work for us too. So that's when we put together kind of the WRIF dream team of old, with us doing mornings, then Ken Calvert coming in to do middays, then Arthur Penhollow did afternoons, then Karen Savelli at night, and then there was a variety of people, ultimately ending on Steve Costan to do late nights.
Wow. You mentioned that's an all-star team. And having conversation with Ken Calvert, again, jumping way ahead, but you're the reason that Ken left the record business to come back to WRIF. Is that correct?
It is. Well, it was at that time that we were putting the band back together, as Kenny liked to say. God rest his soul.
Yeah.
And he liked the idea of what we were putting together. Plus, at the time, he was going through kind of a very sad divorce in Chicago. He was very miserable about the divorce, needed and wanted to change the scenery. So he came on board.
That must have been a cool experience to work with all the greats. It was like this 27 Yankees.
It was fun, and I'll tell you what made it fun is we were at the right age where really not many of us had any responsibilities other than work, and we were all friends. So we did everything together. Even after work, it would be like, well, we'll meet you over at so-and-so for cocktails, or, we're all going to the Kiss concert tonight at Cobo. Let's go. And we would just do things together. We played softball.
I was going to ask you about the softball games, because those were infamous.
We bowled together. We had a bowling team.
Talk about the softball games. For people who don't know, it was started with Journey, games with Journey, because people don't know Journey stayed in Detroit for like a whole summer, but you played against other musicians and other radio stations. Talk about some of those experiences, if you would.
Yeah, so there was an actual league, a media league, and we used to play on Belle Isle every week. So we had a team, some of the guys really serious, other guys, okay. But we actually, managed to muddle our way along a little bit. And through the course of that, we would invite acts when they came to town to play softball. We had a couple of really good games at Southfield High School with Journey. And we got to be friends with those guys and spend a little time with them. And it attracted a lot of people.
Speaking to that, one of my brother-in-laws always makes fun of South Detroit's the river. But a story that I heard was that Journey was heading to Detroit, and they saw a sign on 75 that says South Detroit.
I-75, South Detroit.
It wasn't saying that South Detroit. That's just where that lyric came from. And now it's everywhere.
That's a true story.
Yeah, that's
a true story.
So what other organizations, obviously you played against the other radio stations, were there other bands besides Journey that you guys played against?
There were a few along the way. I can't even remember most of them. We'd always invite them. I think we played with a couple of guys in Grand Funk. Sometimes it wasn't the whole band like Journey. Maybe it was just a guy or two.
Sure.
I feel like Eddie Money joined us for a softball game at one time or another.
Wow.
I feel like one of them was a couple of guys from Foreigner along the way, but I'm a little fuzzy.
That's cool. I saw a picture. Ken shared with me a picture of you mentioned the bowling league. A very young Eli Zarrett was rubbing elbows with you guys back in the day too.
Eli Zarrett was our sports guy on the morning show.
Yeah.
For a number of years. In fact, Eli and I had a thing that we did together every Wednesday called the Eli and JJ Wednesday Challenge.
I remember that, yeah.
Where listeners would challenge us to games of any kind, from basketball to volleyball to tennis to archery to field hockey, badminton, that kind of stuff. So every week we would embark on a new challenge with a couple of our listeners.
Now, when you think of your time at WRIF, you worked for a couple of PDs. Do you have a couple of favorites? I know Mark Pasman was the PD, Fred Jacobs was the PD. Do you have favorites, and which ones and why?
Oh, I like them all and I hate them all. Tom Bender was the program director when we were hired at WRIF. Really good guy, really smart guy. He then became general manager of the station. And Fred Jacobs, who was the research director, imagine having the amount of money to have a radio station nowadays with their own research director.
Right.
Unheard of. So he became the program director. Then he moved on to form of his own consulting firm, which he still has today.
Right.
And then Mark Pasman became the program director for a time during those days.
I do want to ask you about a specific individual we haven't mentioned, but he's been very important to my radio career later on when he was at Specs Howard. But I want to ask you about him as a younger man, and I think he was the first PD at WRIF before you even got there. But I know you got to know Dick Kernan. Talk to me about your thoughts about Mr. Kernan.
Love Mr. Kernan. We butted heads over a few issues. Before I'll give you the beginning of Dick Kernan in my life. When I was at W4 just doing middays, before I became the program director, actually Jerry Lubin was the program director at the time, and our ratings weren't very good, to be honest with you. There wasn't a lot of structure. In fact, the last iteration of that radio station before I became program director, and it wasn't because of me, I'll get to that in a second, but we had a meeting and he said, here's my idea. There are 6 of you. We each did 4-hour shifts. And he said, design your own show. Play whatever you want to play. Design your own show.
Never happened today, but that's cool.
Right. It was fun, but it sounded like shit. Because it sounded like 6 different radio stations.
Right.
There was nothing that would identify that. The morning show as the afternoon show, middays and nights. You wouldn't able to recognize it. So enter Dick Kernan because our station manager brought him in as a temporary Band-Aid to try to patch things up to get us back on the right track. And I'll never forget, he came in and on the chalkboard with a piece of chalk, he said, here's what I think after listening to this station, a typical W4 listener looks like. And he drew this character from Mars that had, I mean, everything from old people to young people. It was all over the road, unrecognizable as a human being. And that sort of drove the point home. I kind of get it. You got to be a little more consistent than that.
That's great.
So back to me not being responsible. It was actually a guy, and speaking of Dick Kernan, the guy who actually put WRIF on the air. Actually, before it was WRIF, it was WXYZ FM. That was a young kid at age 16 named Lee Abrams.
Lee Abrams, wow.
And Lee Abrams came to become one of the greatest radio consultants in history.
Wow.
And so I worked with Lee to develop a format, which was kind of his cookie cutter format, but we tailored it to our city and our audience and our station a little bit. And it was wildly successful. So I got to ride on the coattails of greatness.
I do want to ask you about it. I don't think you worked there, but I mean, obviously WRIF pulled out ahead from those rock wars that were early on, W4, Wheels, and ABX. Talk to me about the reputation that ABX still pulls today, even though it hasn't been on the radio forever.
Well, I think ABX gets its reputation from being the first. And that's part of it. And they had many colorful characters along the way as jocks. Some of them then came over and worked at W4. I mentioned Jerry Lubin, Jerry Goodwin, Ken Calvert was at ABX for a while. Dan Carlisle, another name from that era. And I think I never worked at ABX, and part of the reason is it never even occurred to me to work for ABX because in their early days, I was in Mount Pleasant or Lansing doing my own thing, going to school, playing football, then in radio. And ABX wasn't really on my radar.
Sure.
But I worked in Flint and then subsequently in Lansing with Mark Addy, who we mentioned earlier. And he and I became close friends. He ended up going to W4, and I would come down and visit him like on a Saturday night. He would take me down to the radio station on Jefferson Avenue. It was an old Victorian mansion. The control board faced out the picture window on the second floor overlooking Jefferson Avenue. Imagine the activity in the mid-'70s on Jefferson Avenue on a Saturday night. And you go in the studio, it's all dark except for a couple of candles and a small table lamp. And there's patchouli oil and there's incense and the smell of marijuana everywhere in the studio while you're listening to Edgar Winter's Frankenstein at full blast. I fell in love. It was love at first sight. So I made that a goal. That was one of those things you picture, right? I put a little picture of W4 on my refrigerator and focused on it and willed it to happen. And I think that's ultimately how I ended up there a couple of years later.
Another thing that you did in those early days is you filled in with Kelly and Company. Talk to me about how that came to be and talk about that experience.
Yeah, I don't actually know how they came to that decision. It started out as I would do pieces for their news program at night, and they dubbed me entertainment editor for whatever that's worth.
Okay.
It paid nothing. Right. It paid nothing, but I had a good title. So I would go out and do pieces on culture and a lot, obviously, pertaining to music in and around the Detroit area. So they'd give me a crew, and I'd go shoot a piece on camera, and they'd play it. And back, they made the same mistake that we did with parody songs. They were all too long. Right. I would find I go back and look at some of these things now, and I'm doing a stupid piece from a bar somewhere, and this thing goes on forever, 3.5, 4 minutes. I'm like, holy cow. So that led to, it led actually not to Kelly and Company, it led to Good Afternoon Detroit. Okay. Hosted also by John Kelly and Marilyn Turner, a magazine-style TV format.
Oprah Winfrey took that idea and made it her own, but she kind of stole that whole format of what John and Marilyn were doing, right?
Yes.
But go on, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, she stole it well, though.
Yeah, she did.
I would admit.
She did.
So I would do, I was an on the street reporter and doing similar pieces to what I had done as entertainment director for the news programs. And so that led to them going on vacation and myself and Dana Eubanks, if you remember that name from local TV.
There was Diana Lewis and there was Dana Eubanks, yep.
And Dana and I would then co-host while they were on vacation.
Okay.
And I don't recall why, but I feel like when they were on vacation from the morning show, I did the show by myself.
Interesting.
So I don't know why I had a co-host in the afternoon and not in the morning, but that's just how it was back then, and it all seemed fine.
Now that could have been
fun.
That could have. I'm going to ask you about that. Could have been a pivotal moment where, okay, now I'm moving on to television. How come you didn't do more in television and you just kind of went back to radio? Was radio more fun for you, or was just TV?
Yes, and it was. First of all, I would have had to start at the very ground floor of TV.
Sure.
And I was already in a successful position doing morning radio and making good money doing it. So I would have had to throw that away and start over again in a new media. Now, not to say I couldn't have done it, but by then I think I was married, might have had a kid by then. Don't remember the exact circumstances, but radio was just a better fit for me. Plus, I will tell you this, that back in those days especially, TV was a pain in the ass. If they sent me out to do a piece, they'd send me out with a camera guy, a sound guy, a lighting guy, a producer, a director, and me in a big van. There was like 6 people on the shoot, and they would start fighting with each other about how it was going to go and how the lighting wasn't right and how the sound wasn't right, and there'd be infighting. So all of a sudden, to do a 3-minute piece, you're there for 4 hours a day for 2 days in a row trying to get one 4-minute piece done. And it was hurry up and wait. Even the in-studio stuff, there was always, hang on a second, I need to change the battery. Hold on, we have a lighting issue. I got to fix the lighting issue. So it was always just sit there and wait. So it was minutes of boredom followed by seconds of excitement.
Well, you had this huge successful show, JJ and the Morning Crew. You guys are king of Detroit, if you will. Why? And tell me about the circumstances that had you guys take your show, take your ball, and move down the street to Wheels. Talk about that transition.
Same thing, almost identical, except with one distinct difference. There was one sticking point with us. We had been working Saturdays our entire career up to that point. And we made it known to them long before that we wanted to confine our show to Monday through Friday. We didn't want to have to come in and do a live show on Saturdays. And back then, that was long before voice tracking or anything like that. Right. So you'd have to come in every Saturday morning and be live. And we were just kind of getting burned out with a 6-day-a-week schedule.
That's a lot.
So we told them, that that was the number one issue in our contract. No more Saturdays. And then ownership changed. ABC was forced to sell off some stations. WRIF and WXYZ were a couple of stations they had to sell off, along with Channel 7. And we were bought by a new company right at the end of our contract. The new guy came in, and his first words were, Saturdays are off the table. You got to work Saturdays. We're sorry, but that's just the way it's going to be. So then Wheels, also changing ownership at the time. The new owner didn't take possession. It was owned at the time by Doubleday Books, if you remember the company Doubleday. And they wanted us to come over. So but in the time that the deal was getting finalized, until the time they actually owned it, this new company approached us and hired us independently. So we worked for one guy as a personal service contract for this one guy until the sale was complete. And Saturdays were no longer an issue, and they offered us a boatload of money to come over there.
I can imagine that payday must have been good. Besides the Saturdays, how was it different at Wheels than it was at WRIF as far as what you guys could and couldn't do? Or was it just like, here's you do
Honestly,
what you want?
Yes, as long as it worked. It was pretty much the same. I would say very much the same, from a promotional content to programming to what we did on the air. Very much the same. In fact, every station I have worked at has been sort of similar to that. I've been fortunate enough to have had a lot of free reign along the way.
Now, was Chuck Santoni the PD at that time? Because I know that Wheels was going through a transition where they were doing music and sports. Because I think that's what Mitch Albom and Stoney started doing the show there when you were there.
We brought him in.
Yeah,
I brought Mitch in because we felt like the lifestyles of rock music and sports sort of fit together. Take a look at opening day for Tiger baseball. Look at the Lions. Look at Red Wings, who are really hot, and that was a huge part of our local culture here with sports, and so is music. So we thought, why not combine the best of the two? Didn't really work out as well as I thought it was going to work out. I think what we would have had to do is been able to negotiate a deal to do the play-by-play for one of the major teams in town, and that was not going to happen. But for whatever reason, it worked for us for a period of time. I thought it was going to be bigger and better and maybe a universal format around the country. It just never worked out that way.
And how long did you guys serve at Wheels, and when and how did that end?
We were at Wheels for about 6 years. Our contract came to an end, and I don't know the exact circumstance of how and why, but Ken Calvert was also unemployed at the time, and they wanted to bring him on. And apparently, we weren't privileged to any of those conversations, but apparently they brought him in to do middays. I think he was back to doing middays at the time. But they promised him when our contract was up, he could have the morning show.
Oh, okay.
So, and I don't know the whys or hows of all of that, but we ended up, we probably could have gone to afternoon drive, but we didn't want to.
Right.
So we ended up working out a deal with WOMC at the time.
Oh, so you guys took your show to OMC?
No, sorry.
Yeah.
It was CSX.
CSX. There you go. You guys went to CSX because I was going to mention you guys were there for a couple of years, but that had to be that had to remind you a little bit of the WRIF days when you got the band back together, because there was a lot of big name jocks at CSX too, right?
Oh yeah. It was a similar kind of situation. Savelli was there, Calvert was there. No Penhollow though. He stayed at WRIF for all of those years. Boy, I'm having a brain fart. I'm trying to remember the name of the morning show that was at CSX at the time, and they were just bad boys. They would show up drunk for client parties, and
wow.
They were just not very dependable as employees. And for the life of me, I can't remember their name right now. But
that's all right.
So they were anxious to get rid of them, and we were available, so it all worked out.
And so that had to be a little different, because now we're getting into, what year are we talking? Because radio's starting to change a little bit.
That would have been, we left Wheels in 1992.
Okay.
And then went to CSX in 92, and I stayed there for 16 years till the end of 2008.
Wow. That's probably the longest you've been at a radio station, right?
It is. I was here at OMC for the last 13 years, but
so how did your role before we get to
longest.
OMC? How did your role change at CSX? Because it did change over those 16 years, didn't it?
It did. I always felt, as I said, evolving notions of how things should go and how things get tired after a while, and you got to evolve them and change them up. I felt like we needed to add another layer to just me and a bunch of fictitious characters. I thought we needed more human interaction as well as the characters, but it would be nice to have another human being to talk to as well. And I tried to convince them of the wisdom of that. And they said, no, don't fix it if it ain't broke.
Right.
I said, well, I'm just telling you, I can feel it. It's changing. And we should get in front of it. And they said, no. And then ratings started flagging, I guess the word is. And they decided instead of going in the direction I tried to convince them was the right thing to do, they said, no, more is better. So they brought in another guy, Ed Kelly, to add to George's voices and pile on more fictitious character voices. And that just didn't work out very well. Plus, it drove a wedge between the station and George. That sort of hurt his feelings, and I think it was part of the reason that he decided to retire when he did at age 40 and move up north.
I think he made the right choice.
So then...
I'm sure as far as a listener, I don't think it was the right choice, but from the conversations I've heard you guys talk about, he was happy after that.
Yeah, I think so. It took a while, I think, to get over it. I think he, had some hard feelings about them bringing another.
Yeah, how can you not take that personally, right?
You do. I agree with that. And so it made it hard for me because I'm trying to, conduct a circus. And I got a couple of clowns that, don't love each other that much. But everybody went along. We got along fine. The shows were great. And we'd also brought in Lynn Woodison as she was a news person for us. But then we expanded her role little by little to be a part of the show. And ultimately, they came to the right conclusion and decided that probably we'd be better off just doing a straight morning show. And as long as George's characters were leaving, Ed stayed with us, and we had a producer named Mark Blackwell who was awesome that participated in a lot of the parodies and a lot of the funny bits. But again, everything changes and evolves, and ultimately it evolved into just Lynn and I for a period of time, for several years at the end of the CSX period of time.
Another thing I want to move on to OMC because you kind of replace someone who I think you guys had very parallel careers. Dick Purton leaves OMC in 2010, and you come in, and not too long after that, and start doing a morning show with his daughter Joanne. Talk about your. I'm getting ahead of myself, but go ahead.
A little ahead of yourself because I came in there to do middays, which I loved.
Okay,
I loved doing middays, 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. I did that for a number of years, actually.
By yourself, right? Not with a partner. 8 or 9 years
by myself, just alone. And then they wanted to make some changes along the way. I saw an opportunity to go back and do mornings again with Dick's daughter, who was doing the morning show with also Channel 7 anchor Stephen Clark. Mm-hmm. And he retired from radio once again, and they came to me, and as you know how our business is changing, there are a lot of voice track stations, and there are a lot of personalities that you'll hear in this market that are actually sending their work in from other places on the planet, be it Baltimore or Philadelphia or New York or whatever. It's just the way things are done, and everything's pre-recorded. And they came to me and said, for obviously a lot less money, maybe you consider staying on, signing a new contract, and you can voice track your show. So it only takes, a short amount of time every day to voice track the show. And I said, well, number one, I don't want to be part of the ushering out of live radio, because that's what I grew up with. That's all I've known. That's what I love. The idea of pre-recording a show every day is sort of boring to me. It sucks, and I don't want to be that guy. I said, plus, I'll tell you what, I'll stay for 2 more years if you give me the morning show, and I'll do it with Joanne Purton. And they agreed to that. We did it for 2 years, and they said, well, I said, well, I'm game if you are. And they said, yeah. So we did it for 2 more years. And that's when I said, that's it.
Before we get too much about that, I want to go back to one of your answers a second ago, because I was getting ahead of it. But you were mentioning, as a PD, and then, of course, as the ringleader, as you referred to it, as of doing a morning show. What was your prep like? How was it different compared to when you just started doing a show on your own from 10 to 3 at 104 there?
For me, honestly, not that much different, because I'm pretty lazy. So I surround myself with people who do all the work. My show prep with George and with Ed and all of that was pretty limited, because those guys were the funny guys. Now, we collaborated on scripts here and there, but generally speaking, they were the ones that were coming up with the content on a daily basis. So we didn't need to spend a lot of time talking about what issues we were going to cover that day, because they came in with ideas already structured for bits that we were going to do. I just get a script and play along.
What was it like, because you started getting back with working with Joanne, was that, did you, because Dick Purton left in 2010. How, are you guys close? Did you know each
Yes.
other? What's your relationship with Dick Purton?
Always friendly. He could not have been nicer to me for my entire career. We would run into each other at various events, whether it was a charity or some sort of function. I remember distinctly there was a conference every year at Central Michigan for radio broadcasters that I'll pat myself on the back for this. A buddy of mine at CMU named Chip Lusko and I came up with this idea of establishing a network of college radio stations throughout the Midwest. It was called Micron. Now I'm trying to remember the name, what the acronym was. It changed a couple of times over the years, but we would hold the conference at CMU every year and invite radio broadcasters from college from all around the Midwest to come, and we'd talk about ideas and so forth. Long after that, they had Dick Purton come in to do a presentation during this conference, and I was a guest there. And out of the blue, and I knew him a little bit, we'd run into each other, but out of the blue, he looks over and he points at me, and he introduced me to the whole crowd there, saying, how cool it was that I came from CMU, what a great job I did, what a nice guy I was, and blah, blah, blah. Out of the blue, unsolicited, I get all these compliments from him, and I thought, wow, that was very gracious and generous of him to do. He didn't need to do that.
Yeah, one of my favorite, I've told this before, but Dick, he was nice enough when he sat down for my movie about the history of radio, and we talked for like 2 hours, and then after we were finished, he goes, well, do you want to come to my basement and see my trophy room? And I'm like, yeah, please. And so we go down there, and there's a picture of him and John Candy. There's a plaque that he was awarded when he was inducted into the National Radio Hall of Fame, and everything else, Jim, was pictures of his kids and his grandkids. That was his trophy room, and that's Dick Purton.
That is 100% Dick Purton, and his daughter is even nicer.
Yeah. So what was it like working with? Now you go from working with a men's locker room to someone as prestigious as Joanne Purton. Was that different for you?
Well,
I mean, I know you were aging at that time. You're a little older.
Not just prestigious, but someone who lived her life at the foot of the cross.
Right. That had to be a little bit of a culture shock for you, no?
Yeah, but I brought her along. I corrupted her just enough. I will tell you, and it was so bizarre. It was Friday, I think it was actually Friday the 13th. We were at the radio station to get our pictures taken. And this was 2019, I guess. And it was right at the beginning of COVID, and we had no idea what was going to happen. So we had our pictures taken on that Friday and had scheduled to get together over the weekend, and we were going to start this show on Monday, the 16th of March. On Saturday, we get a call from our boss saying, the entire state is being shut down on Monday. You can't come into the radio station. We're closed. Nobody's allowed in. And so you guys are now, you have a day and a half to figure out how you're going to broadcast from home. So that's when I started figuring out how I could jerry-rig a system from home. And on that Monday, the 16th, the very first show we ever did together, she came to my house. And she sat here on this little love seat I have near my desk and with a microphone. And I sat up here at the desk with a microphone, and we did our first show like that. And our other partner, Jason Rathel, was at the radio station, and he ran the board and did all of the special effects for us and that kind of thing. We get done at 10 a.m. We get a call from our boss saying, that is a violation. According to the company, you can't even be together. So, Joanne, you have to figure out a way to do the show from your house. Jim, you stay at your house. Jason, you're at the station. And that's how we did the show for the entire 4 years. We've almost never done a show together in person. Wow.
Well, I tell you, for me, I loved listening to you guys broadcast live from the Woodward Dream Cruise. Talk about some of the experiences over the last couple of years, post-COVID, that you've got to do from Woodward. That had to be fun.
It was. We had a lot of fun, especially considering the technology is such now that we have this beautiful device that we could travel with. So we would get a car from a local car dealership, and we'd drive around Woodward, and we'd drive around Pontiac and Birmingham and Ferndale and Royal Oak, all over the place, interview people, just having laughs with them and checking out the cars. It was a blast.
Wow. Well, I want to, before we move on to your retirement, during COVID, I remember having a conversation the first time I reached out to you for you to come on the show. You told me that you were having more fun than you've ever had.
And I'll reiterate that now. Last 4 years, my favorite 4 years in radio. It was relaxed. There was no stress. There was never any tension between the three of us. We had the best chemistry in the world. And, when you have two other people who are so easy to work with, and I like to think I'm easy to work with, we got along great. And we had a lot of laughs, and we evolved. I'm very proud of the JJ and Joanne show for the past 4 years.
Because of that, you can imagine my surprise when I heard you were going to retire. How did you know it was time to hang up the headphones and retire? And talk me through that.
Well, my contract was coming to an end, and I could choose, do I want to do this for 2 more years? Do I want to do this for another year? And I will tell you, there are a couple of things along the way that sort of was a gut punch. Like Frank Beckman retires, and 3 weeks later, he's announced with some crazy form of dementia. And a month after that, he's dead.
That was horrible. He didn't even get to enjoy it, Jim.
I know. And so that's my point. I thought, okay, my contract is coming to an end. Do I want to see more of the world? Listen, I grew up here. I've lived here. I worked my entire career here. I've never really spent much time anywhere else. I've been all over the world for like 5 or 6 days at a time. That's it. Other than that, I've been anchored to this because of work. And I thought, I want to go places. I want to experience new people, new things, new cultures, whatever it may be. Even here in America, I want to learn what it's like being in the South or out West,
right.
I want to see other parts of the world. So, and I want to be healthy enough to do that. And, playing football, my body's, been beat up pretty much. So before I completely run out of gas, I want to have enough energy to do all of that stuff.
We've talked about a number of radio personalities that you've worked with, and I wanted to ask you specifically about, I know another mutual friend, Mike Staff, went and toured and kind of re-interviewed a lot of the RIF jocks. Talk to me about what that was like to go back to RIF for the 50th anniversary and be on the air and meet with some of these people that you grew up with.
Well, it was awesome. It was a piece of nostalgia. I mean, we all remember those days as the heyday of most of our career. That was the sweet spot for those 5 or 6 years. That was the golden time in FM rock radio in Detroit. And we were fortunate enough to be a part of it. And I will also say, I really appreciated the fact that my current employer, WOMC at the time, was nice enough to let me go do that and be a part of it. Very generous of them to do. And it was fun. I mean, nice seeing some of the people. In fact, some of the salespeople who came to say hello are still the same people that were there when I was there all those years ago. So it was old home week, different studio than we were in at the time, obviously, but being back there with Karen Sabelli and Calvert, and Penn Hollow didn't make it, but there were a lot of people, a lot of connection, and a lot of traveling down memory lane to some of the fun that we had together. So it was great. It was awesome. I'm glad they did it, and I'm glad I was allowed to be a part of it.
And not too much longer, you had your own retirement, and I want to ask specifically about a moment because you mentioned Frank Beckman passing away not too long after he decided to retire. One of the moments that I appreciate is on YouTube to view, because I became friends with Ken Calvert over the last couple of years since doing this movie, and you had him on the show the last week before you retired, and he got a little verklempt in reminiscing some of those things. How do you view that moment? Because I'm sure now you're like, oh my gosh, I'm glad we had that moment. Talk to me about when Ken came and talked to you when you were retiring.
I'm so glad we had that moment then, and I will tell you this: when I first moved to Detroit and got a job at W4, Ken Calvert was like the first guy I ever met in Detroit radio, in the Detroit radio business. So, we're about the same age, same interests, and we were both just beginning our radio career. He was in it a couple of years ahead of me, but essentially we were brand new, trying to climb our way up the ladder, right? And then off and on, we worked with each other pretty much at every other radio station that I was at until WOMC. So the first guy I ever met, and one of the last guys that was ever on my show here in Detroit when I retired a couple of months ago. So it was sort of like, tying loose ends. It was a natural sort of ending from start to finish. The circle was complete at that point.
Yeah,
and so I think, he got emotional, I got emotional, everybody got emotional, because it was like the end of an era. I mean, this was, we were a certain group of people during a certain time. It's evolved, and it's probably better now than it ever was. I'm sure it is. But we were the group at that time.
Right.
Now there's a different group. Before us, there was a different group. But this was our group. So we got to share it for our entire career, and I'll always cherish that.
Well, I'm very thankful that it's now that we're getting to talk, because you are a couple months into your retirement, so you've probably had a little bit of time to reflect. But can you share with me one or two of your proudest or favorite moments in your radio broadcasting career?
Oh, man, there's so many. I've got to see the world because of my radio career, from Rio de Janeiro to Moscow to Copenhagen to Honduras. I mean, literally all over the world and all over the country. I think there's one of the things that was drilled into me when I was studying broadcasting was that your first responsibility is to the community you live in. And that is like an FCC mandate. Right. And, the FCC, you used to have a license to broadcast, and you had to hang it up on the wall of the radio station. Those days are long gone. But, the FCC is a federal agency. You had to kind of, dance to their tune.
Right.
So, and I always took it to heart that the first order of business, your first responsibility was to impact the community. I like to think I have done that, at least in a small way, with, pretty much any charity you can think of. Probably the most money we ever raised over a period of years was for the Children's Leukemia Foundation of Michigan. And I became an honorary board member of that organization at the time. And then we did a project, and the reason I bring that up is because we did a project that I'm probably most proud of all. WOMC always had the Woodward Dream Cruise. That was their baby. They sort of led the charge from day one on that. And we were sort of blocked out from participating because they wanted, obviously,
right,
to have ownership of it. We were reduced to being guerrilla warriors and flying planes with banners with our call letters on it during the thing that they couldn't stop us from doing, and other covert guerrilla tactics to try to attach ourselves to it. And one day down the road, many years after it began, we decided, you know what? here's a way we can get away with this. What if we just had our own car in the Woodward Dream Cruise and splash our call letters and our show's name on it and drive up and down 1.5 million people on Woodward all day for the Dream Cruise and on Friday and Saturday and whatever for the whole week. And we thought, okay, well, that's a possibility. We could probably get a car from somebody. And then we thought, well, maybe what if we just borrowed a hot rod from somebody? And then we could put magnetic banners on it or something. Then we thought, well, what if we had our own car that we could drive every year in the Dream Cruise? And it would be, it was at that time, JJ and Lynn. It could be the JJ and Lynn car for every year of the Dream Cruise. And then a listener called up and said, well, you're here in Detroit. This is the home of the automobile. Why don't you just build one?
Right. Makes sense.
Build one? Are you kidding me? And then other callers came in and saying, we have painters and mechanics, people who are designers, and anything you need to put a car together. This is the world capital of the automobile. It's right here. And I thought, okay, where do we get a car? A few phone calls later, the guy says, well, I got a beat up old 67 Mustang you can have. Next call we get is from Roush Racing saying, well, we'll give you a racing motor, a crate motor, brand spanking new to put in that thing. Then we get a call from the Livonia transmission plant saying, you can't put that big a motor in a Mustang because it doesn't have its own frame. The body is an integral part of the frame, and you'll twist that car into a pretzel with that motor. And they said, but we'll build you a custom frame for that car. And one thing led to another. We got in touch with our friends at Bell Tire, who offered us new wheels and tires. Then we had some other people who were doing brakes and other people who were doing the paint and body work. And it became a community project to build this nice car. And at the end of the day, we had it for the Dream Cruise to show it off. And then we would raffle it off with proceeds. The first year we made $100,000 raffling off the car. The next 2 years we made $250,000 each on the next 2 cars that we did. Wow. And it became a thing. We would have put up a website with adopt a part, and we'd list all the various parts that we needed to finish the car, and our listeners could go in and chip in 15, 20, 30, $100, whatever they wanted to buy that part for the car. And then we said, well, we got to have a name for the project, right? Everything was volunteer. We didn't pay a dime for anything, and we didn't pay anybody anything. So we get a general project manager for the thing every year we did it. And that guy was really important. And then we said we need a name for the project, though. One of our listeners told us the story of Stone Soup. I don't know if you're familiar with that story or not. No. It's an ancient story about, I don't know how far back in history it goes, Roman times probably, where soldiers would be marching into a village. They'd see some guy out in front of the gate, and he's boiling water, and they ask him what he was doing, and they say, well, I'm making stone soup. And they look in there, and sure enough, there was a boiling pot of water with a stone in it. And then, then various people would come by and say, well, I've got a carrot. I could throw a carrot in that soup. And somebody else would come in and say, well, I can throw an onion in that soup. And somebody else has part of a chicken they can throw in. At the end of the day, everybody from the community would throw in a little something to the soup, and pretty soon it blossomed into this beautiful meal for everybody.
That's cool.
And we said, okay, well, it forevermore became then the Stone Soup Project.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Here's another reflection question. How do you hope to be remembered as a radio broadcaster? Have you thought about that at all?
No, I haven't. Honestly, I haven't. I don't care.
No, you just did it the way you did it. You did it your way.
I did. And, by the way, that's the other thing. I am so thankful that in this day and age, I was able to go out on my terms and be celebrated. So I guess in answer to your question, we've already done that because we did that the last couple of weeks I was on the air. My partners, Jason and Joanne, made that all happen for me, and I couldn't be happier. And Tim Roberts and Debbie Kenyon from the radio station, they all made the last couple of weeks a couple of weeks for me to remember, and I will always cherish that. As a legacy, I really haven't thought of it, and I don't want anything. I'm happy.
Go ahead.
I'm fulfilled. I've had a great career. I've had a great life, and I've met a lot of great people, so I'm happy.
As a fan of radio, this is one thing that really bothers me, and in addition to the voice tracking, that is one of the reasons I left radio full time. But when I think about some of the stuff that entertained me growing up, is a lot of that stuff wouldn't be able to be pulled off now. So I want to ask you, how do you feel about the current cancel culture that seems to affect how people feel about personalities? If you feel this way, I can't listen to you. I mean, this is a whole new world that I don't think even Dick Burton could have pulled off some of the stuff that he did back in the day now. What's your thoughts on the cancel culture that is society now?
Well, I don't know if you know anything about me. I'm a staunch conservative, so I hate it, and I fight against it whenever I can. And it only impacted me in this way because for the last 14 years or so, occasionally I appear on Channel 2 on a segment called Let It Rip.
Right.
Will Perkins was the host for most of the years.
Right.
And they brought me in to offer conservative views on whatever topic they were talking about. So every couple of weeks I'd be on as one of the panelists on their Thursday night show. But when I moved from doing, and by the way, it was also very generous for WOMC to let me do that because the corporation would never have allowed me to do that. So we kind of cheated. I disclosed to my two bosses here that I was doing it on a Thursday, and they had a power to say no. And there were one or two occasions they said, we don't want you on that panel for whatever reason. It was too controversial.
Sure.
Because they would get phone calls to the front desk complaining about my views of the world. And in radio, they don't want you to share your views. They want you to entertain people, be funny, make people happy. It's a fun thing. It's not a controversial thing, and they didn't want that to happen. And so it all was great until when I started doing mornings with Joanne again. Then they said, we really don't want you to do that anymore because now you're in a higher profile position, and we know it's going to generate a lot of backlash. And by the way, the cancel culture was at a fever pitch by that point, too. And so I, until last week, I hadn't done Let It Rip for 4 years.
Was it like taking off your jacket and saying, okay, I can get a little free here because now I have no restrictions? That had to be nice.
Yeah, pretty much. I wasn't going to embarrass anybody but myself.
Right.
And maybe Channel 2, but I don't think they care about that. They're probably used to backlash. They have a lot of different opinions expressed, and everybody's got an opinion, and everybody hates an opinion. But I'm a free speech guy. I'm a constitutionalist. I'm a First Amendment, Second Amendment. Free speech is the cornerstone of our democracy.
Yes.
And if that's being taken away from us, I've got a problem with that. I'll fight it as hard as I can. And by the way, that's another reason that I decided to retire at the moment that I did, because it's the beginning of an election year, and I want to be unfettered in my treatment and ability to address issues, topics, and candidates during this national election year.
This one's important. This one's for sure important.
Very important.
Yeah. This is kind of a compound on the last question, but what, in your opinion, what is the state of radio today? Because, obviously you and Joanne were must listen to, but there's not much of that identity morning show stuff anymore that goes on, even identifying with a radio station to be part of that club. But from your viewpoint, what is the state of radio today?
I think it's okay, and I think it always will be okay. Have we had to adjust a little bit? Is there the same revenue that there was before the internet? And people always say, oh boy, you must be getting killed by Sirius and XM. And that was never the case. We didn't lose people to Sirius and XM, but we did lose revenue to the internet, because
so did television, though, by the way. Yeah.
Well, yeah, everybody, newspapers, magazines, everybody did, because if you look at it back in the mid 70s, there were 3 TV stations and there were a couple of newspapers and a handful of radio stations that were worthy of your advertising dollars. So you'd be getting a little piece of those different pies. And then with the internet, all of a sudden, there weren't like 8 outlets. There were 8 billion outlets for people to spend their money on. And then they had to use part of their advertising budget to build their own social media presence. And that costs money. There's infrastructure, there's equipment, there's personnel. So they would use what might have been taken from the advertising pile to build their own infrastructure of social media and put out their own messages. So it became less important for them to spend all of their money on radio. So yeah, our piece of the pie was diminished as a whole, but we still represented a great number of people. In fact, as of last year, we had a meeting, and it was discussed that radio was still the number one way to reach people. More than TV, cable, internet, news, radio is still the number one way to connect people, especially on a local level, because people still want to connect with their local sports, local news people, local entertainers. Local is good. Radio will always be local. And I think radio will always be local. I think it's a mistake if they change from that direction, but that's the magic of radio. So in that way, I think it's fine. It'll never be what it once was because there's so many other
choices,
alternatives.
Yeah. Obviously, from the occasional Let Her Rip appearance and maybe some TV appearances, what's next for Jim Johnson?
Who knows? I still have another month, and the promise to myself I was going to take the first 3 months of 2024 and think about it. I don't know. Maybe nothing.
That's okay. A lot of golf, maybe some riding in some new car. Maybe, I don't know.
No new car, but I'm a big fan of e-bikes. So I've got a couple of e-bikes, and I do a lot of e-bike riding. Not for the exercise, I do it for the tourism. I go look at stuff on my e-bike.
My wife bought me a bike a couple of years ago, and I'm getting, I just turned 54, and it's getting to the point where I'm looking at an e-bike because I don't want my bike ride to be canceled because I don't want to go up that hill. I want a hybrid. I want to be able to go out and still ride my bikes. I love it. So
and you can do that with an e-bike. You can set it at any assist level you want to.
Yeah.
From 0 to 5.
It's beautiful. JJ, thank you so much for sharing your broadcast story. It's been a pleasure. It's been an hour and a half. It's just flown by. So I wish you nothing but the best, sir.
I appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity to join your podcast. It's awesome.
Thanks to Jim Johnson, and thank you for checking out Radio Dayz The Podcast. Got a little bit tongue-tied around the master here. Today's show is sponsored by Radio Dayz, 101 Years of Radio, a new docu-series about the history of
Wait a minute, hold on. I have not been on here for 101 years.
No, that's the
I'm
name
not that old, Ron. Come on now.
No, that's the name of the show, the movie, the series. I shared a little bit with you. I made a documentary about the history of radio. And there's in episodes 3 and 4, there's obviously some clips from you in the morning show, but I highlight the radio wars. But check it out; it's a new documentary series about the history of radio. JJ hasn't been around 101 years, but radio has, and you hear the story from those who lived it. You can watch the entire 5-part series on the free streaming service called Reveal, which is spelled REVEEL, which you can download for free on your television, or at Vimeo. You can find out more about that on my website. Click the link of Vimeo at my website, ronrobinsonstudios.com. And today's show is produced by Ron Robinson Studio. Head over to ronrobinsonstudios.com, where you can also hear previous episodes of this podcast as well. And if you'd like to learn more about the aforementioned documentary, Radio Dayz 101 Years of Radio, click on Radio Dayz, the movie, under the Documentaries tab at the website. Thanks for checking out our show, and I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time.
You can't go! All the plants are gonna die!